Give me a nod when give me a something when you think you got most of them.
Go ahead.
All right. Well, good morning. Welcome to the Crisis Management for COVID-19 Week 13. Can you believe this has been going on this long? We've got a great update today from Lexington's Mayor, Linda Gorton, has been working steadily on this. I'll tell you more about her before she speaks, but she's really put a lot of effort in, and we're going to hear from her. And I want you to think about that in terms of city. We're all from different cities. Not everybody on this call is from Lexington, but you know, she represents kind of mayors across the Commonwealth. We also have Tim Feld to join us today, and he's the general counsel for KEME. Because
for me, honey, on my computer. So
look there, we got somebody extra on. Mary, if that's you, hi, glad you're here. Let's mute that thing. Tim Feld is going to have some things to talk about workers' comp and how that is impacting us and what they're seeing across the Commonwealth. So I think that's going to be a lot of fun. Jim Morris is back, and he's always got some great things to talk about. He says he's going to hit the dry stuff first and the fun stuff later, so hang on to the end. And then, of course, you've got Allison and Autumn and Chase here behind the scenes, kind of making sure this all works, keeps moving, and collecting questions. And so we hope we get some great questions today. Just basically, Jim's going to start out with a quick legal updates with some things, and then the mayor's going to join us about 11:15 and give us an update. We're going to talk about some things that are going on in our community right now. That's what number 3 is all about. And then we'll come back to Tim to talk about COVID-19 and workers' comp. And then Jim's going to come back on and wrap up with some other legal updates. So some important things to talk about. You know, tell you what strikes me is that here we are coming out, trying to restart our economies and our companies and stuff, but our numbers are starting to spike all across the country. And so here are just 5 rules. These are from the CDC. They're so critical to what we're doing, like avoiding close contact, and particularly large crowds, staying 6 feet apart, just simple things that we can share with our employees and our families, all of us, just to make sure we're safer. Avoid these confined spaces because the stuff hangs around in the air for quite a long time. Wear a mask, and I think we have to speak up and tell other people when we're around people in the stores and other places. It's hard to say, hey, where's your mask? But we need to encourage everybody to do that. And certainly covering our mouths, and when we're coughing and sneezing, it's hard to sing covering your mouth, but you know what they're saying is when you're breathing a lot, you're putting a lot of this stuff in the air. And so often we are most contagious right as we're getting the thing. We don't even know we have it sometimes, and we're highly contagious. So just really important that we're careful about all that. And then continue to wash our hands, clean ourselves, you know, clean the environment around us and stuff. I've got one other thought. You know, there's a famous quote in the Bible about faith, hope, and love, and how important those things are. But I think right now, I mean, all of them are important, but one that really strikes me is that hope is essential to a great life. I have a guy that I followed and worked closely with for years named Millard Fuller. He was the founder of Habitat for Humanity, and a lot of you know I've been heavily involved in that over the years. And he always said, when you don't have hope, it often leads to a difficult life, a negative way of living. And he said, but hope is essential to a great life. And when we're hopeful and we're optimistic about things, our lives are going in the right direction. And hope is about the future. It colors everything about our lives in a positive way. And so I think we need to keep these 5 rules in mind and keep hope in mind, that we continue to believe in a positive future and create that positive future for those around us. So, Jim, are you ready to jump in and take over?
I don't know. We'll find out.
Get us started with the latest legal updates.
All right, sir. So you all already met me, so I'm going to give you the EEOC guidelines first. There are some big updates this week. Some of these may sound silly, but they are real, and the EEOC is going after things. The other thing I wanted to say is I did want to share as we're getting into this general thing, which is we've talked about whether or not it's time for this webinar to switch focus and start looking at maybe hot topics that aren't necessarily all driven by COVID-19, whether I ought to start doing with Lyle discussions related to workers' comp in general. Now, that'll still cover some of the COVID-19 and the impact on the work from home, notification of the switch of things like that. Also, should we start talking about reducing your footprint and what that means to companies, because you no longer need a footprint the size you had, or you need a different configuration. So we want to hear from you all, and we have this chat session on here. If you think that we've run our course with this, I'd love to know that, because I'd like to be talking to you about things that you want to talk about. If you feel like there's more things to talk about on this, that's fine. We originally thought this would be a 1-month thing, and then the government keeps throwing new ideas and new problems and new quote-unquote solutions that cause us to need to talk about more things. So if you're interested in this continuing the way it is, I'd love to hear that. If you want to switch it and have a hot topics type thing that gets a little bit away from COVID, I'd love to hear that too. Came up with this idea as a hot topic and COVID happened. So that's why we're here. It's been great, so I'm not suggesting that we don't do it. I'm just thinking that maybe we talk about other ideas as well. So think about that. All right, so here we go. EEOC came out with new guidelines on June 11th last week. We had a whole list of EEOC. Let me see if I can grab them and pull them on the screen. I don't know where they went. I was going to share them with you, but somehow, oh, here they are. So EEOC came out with new guidelines last week. We talked about these before. If you click on these, you can get a lot of questions and answers, technical assistance publication. This is where this information is coming from. And so you'll notice these letters on here. These letters correspond with the letters on the notification. Accommodations. I want to walk through these because they are questions I get every day from my customers or my clients. So this one is a critical one that it's common sense, but you wouldn't believe the number of employees pushing employers. Basically, the question is, if somebody has someone else who is sick in their family and they're afraid of getting them sick, can they insist on accommodations from you as the employer to protect their family member at home? And the answer is no. The ADA only applies to an employee, not to an employee's family members. So the answer from the government is correct on this. You don't have to give them. You can give additional accommodations if you know somebody has an elderly parent at home, a new child at home, if their spouse is immunocompromised, but you are not required under the law to give that accommodation. So that's one. The next question about harassment. So these were focused on Asian, but it goes beyond that. So I wanted to talk about it a little bit. The COVID-19 came out of Wuhan, China, so there are some that are suggesting that there might be a problem with, trying to get my highlighter off the screen there, sorry. Might be a problem with people discriminating against people of Asian descent. Basically what this is, I call it the golden rule when I do my training for companies, when I'm talking about management training, employee, how you handle employee situations. If you treat everybody identically, I don't care if you're a terrible employer, if you treat everybody like crap, as long as you treat everybody the same like crap, you're fine. You start picking on people because of any type of protected classification, that's when you get in trouble. One of those protected classifications is national origin and race. So if you start treating somebody from China or an Asian individual differently from people in your office, that's where you get in trouble. So the EEOC spent a page and a half saying, remember kindergarten, treat everybody the same, don't treat anybody differently. But It did go on to talk about how managers should be alerted to demeaning, derogatory, and hostile remarks directed to employees who are or are perceived to be of Chinese or other Asian national origin, including about the coronavirus or its origins. So just a little friendly reminder from our EEOC. And another thing overall, I really noticed this week with each one of these updates you're going to get that our government is getting back to work. People are now looking for ways to go after employers, and the EEOC is basically putting you on notice. Don't play games because we're going to start going after people. The next one, it's common sense again, but they are announcing it, and it's important to cover. Anyone who's teleworking, they're still covered by your company because you're authorizing them to work from home. So if somebody is harassing somebody through electronic communications, you need to make sure to protect that person from those communications. If they are an employee of yours that's doing the harassing, or a known customer or anyone else, you have to protect your employees. So that goes to the national origin as well. So they pointed out here that emails are part of this. And you're going to see later today on some of the kind of humorous things. One of the things that you have to be careful of are emails. Don't send emails. You'll find that out in a second. All right, so return to work. We covered this a little bit about the reasonable accommodations. I think in week 4 or week 5, we had a discussion about accommodations and whether or not you could start taking some steps now. Back then, when I talked to you about it, I said that there was a limitation that they were putting on what type of expenses you had to incur because companies were struggling, and they said, hey, we'll take that into consideration. You don't have to necessarily do everything to the top of the best chair, the best seat, the best keyboard rest, and so on. They've kind of backed off of that because now companies are working. So their suggestion or their direction now, they go back to their ADEA, ADA, and the CDC guidelines, but they are saying that you need to start asking you can start asking your employees, because when they return to work, you're required to do things the correct way. So that's one. The next one is, what should you do if an employee asks for an alternate method of screening? Now, the way they framed this was under ADA, if they have a difficulty doing a certain type of screening, you have to do a reasonable accommodation. But the thing that they then tucked in very quietly is religious accommodations. You have to also follow through with your religious accommodations. And if that matches under Title VII, you have to give them an accommodation on the type of testing you're giving, type of screening you're giving. How that works, I'm not quite sure, because if you outsource this to a third party, I have yet to have any of my employers ask for any type of different accommodation. We're doing the test that's mandated by the CDC. We're doing the screening mandated by the CDC. I don't know what they mean by this with religious and other types of tests. I guess if the person has like nasal surgery, you're going to have to come up with a different test before they can come back to work without sticking the test mechanism into their nose. But I'm not sure whether you can do that with a reasonable accommodation. And it does actually say on there, it has to be reasonable and the cost is a factor. Age-related concerns. This is critical for all of you on this call. I've said it before, now it's official in the EEOC. You are prohibited from discriminating against anybody over the age of 40. That includes, even if you're doing this for a humanitarian effort, you cannot involuntarily exclude any employee based on age, even if you believe you're doing so to protect an employee. It is illegal. Go back to my reference to the Walmart greeter. You can tell them what the risks are. You can tell them your concerns. You can show them what the advanced age issues are. You can talk to them about the CDC, but if they say, I want to do this and this is the job I want to do, you cannot say, no, I'm going to put you somewhere else. I'm not going to allow you to do your job. You can recommend the reasonable accommodations, and they strongly encourage it. but don't engage in discrimination with them. Don't refuse to give them some other position. And also, by the way, even though the ADEA does not allow for a reasonable accommodation for older, you can provide some type of flexibility. Give them something else to do and protect them the best you can, but be open and honest with them and let them do what they're going to do if they refuse. Then also be aware, and this is a little hint, they are entitled to reasonable accommodations for any disabilities that may be age-related. If they have arthritis, if they have hearing issues, if they have sight issues, and you can do accommodations related to ADA, but that has to be done in accordance with the employee. You can't force it upon them, so just keep that in mind. One other screen, and then we can, unless you want to stop here, Lyle, this is the last screen, and I can go through it really, really quick.
Go fast.
All right.
Okay.
All right,
Mayor's ready to go.
Okay, caregiver issues. If an employer provides telework, modified schedule, or other benefits to employees with school-aged children, are there sex discrimination issues? Come on, people. I don't even know why this is a commonly asked question from the EEOC. Don't treat men differently than women just because she's the mom and you thought she'd stay home with the kids. If you get a request from a male saying that I'm the one that's staying home, don't go there. Let the male stay home. Don't give any gender suggestions. Seriously, that's in there. And I put golden rule again. It's just common sense. The last one's pregnancy, and this is really, really critical. A lot of questions have come in to me about what do I do about the pregnant person in my office, and I'm worried about them getting COVID. Same thing as age. I almost combined it. You cannot involuntarily put them in a position because of their pregnancy. However, the next question on here, is there a right to accommodation based on pregnancy? As many of you, most of you on here who are HR know, pregnancy itself is not a disability. If you have symptoms related to your pregnancy, they can be a disability. And then, of course, under the PDA, Pregnancy Discrimination Act, which amended Title VII, there are certain protections afforded women because it is not a disability in and of itself. So you have to treat them all exactly the same as similarly situated employees, which are exactly the same as the golden rule. Don't treat people differently based upon any kind of protected classification, and you'll be doing good. The thing it says down here, and then I'll be done, is always treat every pregnant woman the same as any other similarly situated employee. All employees in one position get treated identically. If you want to treat them badly, do so across the board. That's it. So the EEOC has given these updates. I'll be going through a little bit more later. I've got an OSHA update. I've got a crime and punishment update. You want to stay for that because some of you are going to deal with it, but it is kind of funny. So there we go.
All right. Jim, thank you very much. We really appreciate it. We are delighted to welcome Mayor Linda Gorton. She is the longest continually serving member of the Lexington-Fayette Urban County Council. She's in her second year as our mayor. I think she's doing a terrific job. She's not only facing the COVID challenge, but also recent protests concerning racial inequities and so forth. So she stepped up. She is a team builder. She's a problem solver. And so I think we're fortunate to have her here. She immediately closed some of the senior living facilities, which I think made a big difference. I have a 95-year-old father-in-law in one of those facilities, and they don't have a single case at this point, knock on wood. The quick action is making a big difference. She's also done that with visitors to the jail and a variety of other things to really keep our citizens safe. So, Mayor Gorton, are you with us?
I'm with you. Good morning, Lyle. How are you?
Just fine. I'm so delighted you could take a few minutes and chat with us.
Thank you.
Fire away. I know you've got some good message to share with us, and I imagine we'll get a few questions.
All right. Very good. Good morning, everybody. You know, my daughter texted me recently. She lives in New Mexico, and she said, "Mom, you got a pandemic. you got a $40 million budget shortfall, and now you have protests. What else could go wrong? And I said, well, I think it's been about 150 years since the New Madrid fault blew, so we might have an earthquake. Who knows? We're sort of in crisis mode, so we can handle whatever comes our way, right? But I believe most of you, if I remember correctly, Lyle, are human resources managers, and so you are facing challenges from COVID-19, and all I'll say about when I ran for mayor is be careful what you ask for, right? Because you may get a lot more than you thought. And so over the weekend, Lexington marked its 20th death from COVID-19, and we surpassed 1,100 cases here. And COVID-19 is still out there, and we are still encouraging everyone to social distance, wear masks, continue to wash your hands. And over the weekend, I did read some articles about the thinking for the fall, and there is some thinking that there will be a bigger resurgence in September. So really, until we get a vaccine for this virus, it is going to be out there. I want to talk just a quick second about the personal protective equipment, which has been an issue for all of us. The urban county government here in Lexington has spent a few $1,000s trying to secure adequate supplies for our employees. And I know that businesses have done the same. So most of our citizens have been very supportive of this, following guidelines, protecting themselves, staying in. And I believe because of our diligence in the beginning, following the governor's guidelines and the CDC guidelines, Fayette County's numbers have stayed relatively flat. If you've seen any of the graphs about our cases of COVID and our deaths, they have stayed much flatter than cities around us in the region. Lyle mentioned that early on I closed our nursing homes and long-term care facilities. Kentucky got its first case, you will remember, on March the 6th. And I come from a nursing background. I spent a full career in nursing. I'm a registered nurse. And I immediately realized that any place where we had a congregation of people, it was a vulnerable spot. So we had our first case the 6th. By the 9th, I had closed our jail to visitors. I had closed our long-term care facilities, and I had closed our senior citizens center. And I actually closed those before the state issued the closure because they were our vulnerable populations. And we have stayed relatively COVID-free in those spots. The Federal Medical Center was a different animal. And of course, we don't control the federal prisons. So we worked really hard with them because they did start getting cases in the inmates there. And we finally got to a spot where we could get people there tested. So one of the things that I started working on a while back was Lexington's plan to reopen our economy. And we called it our Blueprint for Economic Recovery. And Central Bank Chairman and President Luther Deaton and I co-chaired this committee that was made up of about 132 business leaders, community leaders, representing our major sectors. And these men and women put together 330 recommendations for reopening here in Fayette County, and then we sent Governor Beshear a copy of it. We weren't asking for his approval so much as wanting him to see what our thoughts were, because he's been following CDC guidelines as he's gradually reopened things. And so We've tried to help businesses wherever we could. Many of you might remember that when restaurants were getting ready to open, we looked at and enacted ways to relax our ordinances that prevented restaurants from having seatings on patios and parking spaces and in parking lots. And that has helped many of our restaurants to expand their capacity while they're limited inside. And so, you know, we're seeing this gradual reopening, and urban county government is still closed to the public. We have not opened our front doors yet, and we have transitioned every single place where citizens used to come to do certain things like file a development plan, pay their revenue, pay their taxes to revenue, things like that, where they used to come inside to do that. We've worked it so they don't have to come inside anymore. We've got drop boxes, we've got online systems. We had to put a lot of this into place. And so it's really helped us accommodate the public. The other thing, which we were not as well prepared for as we could have been, was telecommuting, teleworking at home. And what we have discovered through all of this is we don't need square footage so much as we need good technology. And so we have already invested more in technology, and we made it possible for several hundred of our employees to work from home. Many of them are still working from home. And when we considered how to bring back some of our employees, we decided to be very intentional about allowing them to continue to work at home if they wanted to. And so those who are coming in, we've got some systems in place where some will work here in the government building Monday, Wednesday, Friday, others will work Tuesday, Thursday. And so we are continuing to do those sorts of things so that we can have our employees be safe. We all take our temperatures. Those of us who are coming in every day, we take our temperatures as we come in. We answer the questions that we're required to answer, whether we've been around people who have COVID, whether we have symptoms, et cetera, et cetera. And so we're complying with that throughout government. And so, you know, we've got a long way to go, I realize, to get everybody back to work. And I want to remind you all, for me personally, March the 6th, when the first case of COVID was discovered in Kentucky, seems like months and months and months ago, years ago in some ways. And in February, prior to the outbreak, Fayette County here, our jobless rate was 3.1%. And we were on an upward trajectory with our economy. Things looked good. And then, you know, that beginning the week of March the 8th, people started losing their jobs as more and more businesses close. And by the end of March, our unemployment rate here went above 25%, the highest in over 100 years. And so we knew that thousands of people had been let go. And we have looked at ways that we can help small businesses. Many caterers, other food-related businesses started feeding people. They started feeding laid off employees. They started feeding thousands of people so that people could get through this. We put a hold on any evictions from apartments and housing because we knew people didn't have money to pay their rent. And so it's been a concerted effort, just every day, different decisions to make this work for people. And I'm an optimist, Lyle. I think you know that. And I'm very confident that we will get back. Our economy will recover. It is going to take some time. It is not going to be a matter of a few months. Our financial forecasters at the federal, state, and local levels all believe this. This will be a slow recovery. And I think we can emerge in a position of strength, which is what we all want. And internally, we have struggled with our bottom line big time, like everybody else. And what we saw in looking forward for our fiscal year 21 budget, which starts July 1st, was a potential revenue shortfall of $40 million. And so we're going to we were able to write and construct a budget that did use part of our economic contingency fund, which is our rainy day fund. And we have constantly been in touch with our bond counsel and our financial advisors to be sure that we're doing what we need to do to stay financially sustainable. And so this was a huge challenge. As you all, I think, know, we're heavily dependent on our occupational license fees, our local income tax, and our net profits tax on businesses. And so when businesses started closing, those revenues went away. And so for us here, the impact on our finances has been severe, immediate, really devastating in some ways. And so, but we're dealing with it. You know, that's what we do. Most years, the mayor writes a budget, the council passes the budget, and we go on. This year, what we'll be doing is looking at that budget very carefully every month to see if we can make our budget, to see if what we need to do to change. In the current budget, we are going to make our current budget because we not only froze 47 positions last year, but we have now defunded them. And that was a few $1 million worth of impact to our budget. So we are not basically not hiring those folks. And we also encumbered all operational monies in order to meet the current budget, which ends June 30th. And so we're now in a different phase, and the council has passed a budget. And so many of you know that the CARES Act was passed, and money was allocated to each state, and cities of 500,000 or more were given a direct allocation of money to help with COVID-related expenses. We have now been allocated a pool of money for Lexington Fayette government to apply for reimbursement of our COVID-19 related expenses. For example, we can get reimbursed for the money we spent for PPE. We can get reimbursed for the money for our police who had public-facing duty. We're working directly with the public. And so this process of applying for these reimbursements is anything from March 1st through December 30th, potentially can qualify. We have to document it, of course, with receipts and payroll, and it all has to be documented for reimbursement. And so we have prepared our first application, and the council passed the accompanying resolution that we have to go to the state. And then we'll be, after they've looked at it and approved it, we'll be signing a memorandum of agreement with the Department for Local Government so that we can receive these reimbursements. And so we're still focused on tightening our belts, living within our means. As I alluded, we've cut inside government, we've cut outside government, but we will become and be sustainable financially. And we are looking at this as a 2 or 3 year process to get through to where we're back at a more healthy level in terms of employment, revenues, people, and that time we hope we'll see a vaccine. And then I wanted to end on a different note, and then I can take a few questions if there are some. I'm constantly making a plea for our nonprofits. Our nonprofits in the community have stepped up big time to get us through sheltering people, feeding people, those kinds of things. And I started what's called the Mayor's Fund for the Greater Good, and it's purely to help some of these struggling nonprofits, and they're caring for people in need. And so it's an opportunity for our public to contribute to this. And so if you go to bgcf.org and click on the Mayor's Fund for the Greater Good, you can find that. So it is housed at the Bluegrass Community Foundation, and we're having very good response to that. And those monies will get distributed to our nonprofits. So I could talk a lot longer, Lyle. There's a lot going on all over government, and but I won't. I'll kind of stop there and see if there are any questions.
That was a great update. And Allison and Jim, do we have some questions for the mayor?
I don't think we've had any come in.
Okay. Well, you've answered them all.
Oh,
That's
well.
Oh
my goodness.
Employment never stops with the city. You know, our services continued right along. So you've just had to build this airplane while you were taking off.
We absolutely have built it as we've been flying it. And, you know, our parks are a great example of how we have done that. You might remember in the beginning, what happened was in parks, thousands of people were gathering because the weather was nice. Remember, February and March, the weather was nice. And we had 4,000 people one day at Raven Run, and we had hundreds on the golf courses, not playing golf, they were just gathering. So we closed the golf courses, we closed Raven Run, and then we worked on how to reopen them safely. And parks really turned on a dime. You know, they figured out how everybody could schedule their tee time electronically, pay electronically, distance the tee times, one person per cart, et cetera, et cetera. Then the golf courses were able to open back up. We did this with everything in parks, and our playgrounds, as some of you may know if you have young children, our playgrounds are still closed. And we had to close the pools, the city-owned pools, for the summer. But we've just, every day, we have made the decisions we needed to make to keep our people safe and still provide good basic services.
I heard you speak last Thursday, and you said, I think 25% of our workforce is unemployed right now.
We actually, by the 1st of April, were above 25%.
Oh my God.
I've kind of forgotten the number. It seems it was somewhere around 40,000 new unemployment claims, people who had never been unemployed. 40,000. It was shocking.
Yeah. And across the state, that number is just tremendous. We're getting people used to doing polls while we're on here. So I want you to hang with me for a minute, because I'm going to come back to the charity issue in just a second. But I want to fire a poll off right now and just ask, on this call, how many of you are employed? How many of you are still employed? I just want to see what this number looks like. And if it popped up on your screen, Mayor, you can answer this too.
I just did.
I'm putting yes. Okay. In just a moment, we'll have a number here.
Well, and it's interesting, if I might interject something, Lyle. For all of March and April, I was on a call with the governor and Mayor Fisher 3 times a week. And we are down to 1 time a week. But one call, I had to admit, when he said everybody 65 or over was supposed to be staying home, I had to admit to him that I'm in that age group and I had been going to work every day. And
are they going to send a substitute?
he didn't say, he just said, you need to be careful. Of course, we were masked. Our staff was down to minimum. There was very little chance for anything, but
Yes.
oh, wow,
Look
look
at
at that.
So this is good, because I know these people are carrying the burden like you were. They can't
Yes.
quit their jobs. It's too important to have them there so we can get everybody else there. So I wanted to just see where we stood. I'm not surprised, and I'm sorry that we have 1% that's not employed. If they'll call me later today, we'll see what we can do.
Yes.
But pull that thing down, and let me just say something about the coronavirus charities, because see, a number of weeks ago, I called the mayor and I said, my team at work wants to do something to help out some people in need in our communities. And so you directed me to that Bluegrass Community Foundation website. And so I went through that and I picked out some of those charities that I thought our team might get excited about it. And our team then voted on what they would donate to those charities. And so I want to put those up here real quickly, Jim, because I'm going to ask the folks on this call if you'd like to donate to some of these groups. And so she mentioned the Mayor's Fund, and that's just trying to help make up for the shortfall with our social service agencies, because there's so much responsibility falls on cities to take care of our people in need. And so that's one of the ones that's really important. Let's put the second one up. Now, keep these in mind, because I'm going to go through 4 of these real quickly. There's a coronavirus response fund, and this is it's run by the United Way of the Bluegrass and the Bluegrass Community Foundation together to reach out to people and help, all kinds of organizations that are doing really good work. So they've already raised and given out $600,000 in grants to help keep some of our nonprofits rolling. So that's a really good fund right there. What's the next one? This is interesting. We have a big arts community in Central Kentucky and throughout the state. But what's happened to those jobs? They have completely dried up. No one's going, you can't go to a play. You can't go to the performances. So those people are really struggling. So there's a fund just for that. And then the last one, this one really, not quite yet. This one really gets to my heart, this Nourish Lexington. Because in our schools in Lexington, and I'm sure this is the case across the state, nearly half the people are on food subsidy. They're getting free lunches, because they're not getting the food they need at home. So we already had that problem. Now they're not going to school. So we have groups, they put together groups of people that work in the food service industry, but don't have jobs right now. They're being hired to help put together meals, to help get those meals out to children and families and elderly in our communities, to help them have, food they need just to keep going. So 4 really important charities. Now I'm going to make you a deal right now. We're going to put up a thing here that is going to list these 4. And if you are willing to say you will donate to one of these 4 or all of them, we're going to match. We're going to put $10 towards everybody that says they'll do that. And if everybody on the call does it, well, it's over $1,000 just to put towards this. And
Hey,
so if
Lyle.
you'd like to do this, we're not going to
Yeah.
track. Yes,
Lyle.
Jim? Yeah?
I'll match that.
All right, I'll
Whoa.
take that.
Wow.
Lyle,
Okay.
on behalf of Kentucky Employers Mutual, we'll match it as well.
All right,
Wow.
Tim, thank you. Well, so the idea is you don't have to say what you're going to do right here, but we will follow up this call. If you click on here that you'll give to one of these, we'll follow up this call and send you a note saying, thank you, here's who you contact. and we'll send your name to this organization so that they'll know to expect something from you. So it's just a way to kind of keep things moving in our community. They're so important. So take a minute. I hope you'll check off at least one of these, and because we'd like to donate. And it sounds like we got Morris & Morris Law Firm and Keamy that are going to step up and do it. So we got $30 a person for everybody that does it just to get this started. So,
Hey, Lyle, there's another question that just popped in that says, do previous donations during the pandemic count? Hey, John, within reason, yes. Now, if you're going to tell me that you had 50,000 people at Keeneland that donated, I'm not sure that I can match $10 per person, but you personally, absolutely.
Yep. Thank you very much, and we'll look forward to a contribution from Keeneland also. Anyway, come down there and let's get that filled out and get those numbers in. I kind of want to see how this comes out.
Lyle, I wanted
Yeah.
to add one other quick thing I forgot to say. The council has been meeting by Zoom, and until we can until the number of people lifts to 50 or fewer, the council will remain on Zoom.
Oh, wow. Okay. All right.
Yeah, and I just gave that as an update to everyone because I got asked whether there are abilities to have face-to-face. I'll just go ahead and cover some of the questions we've had are, when can we start to have face-to-face? When can everybody come back to work? And the answer is right now under the governor's mandate, he has not changed that. It is still 10 people or less. It is still reduced work, and it is still until June 29th. You can't, that's when he'll allow 50 or less. So, and telework is still being strongly pushed, so you can't force people back from telework either.
Mm-hmm.
And we also got a question that came through my phone about, are you worried about maybe having to back up on some of the opening because, you know, if these numbers start swinging back up, are we going to have to draw back?
Is that for me or for
No,
you?
that's for you, the mayor. Yeah, not Jim.
Okay. Well, you know, we are following the CDC and governor's guidance. And of course, Dr. Craig Humbaugh here is our wonderful commissioner of health. And we have ramped up our testing big time, as well as our contact tracing. And so we've already seen a bit of an uptick in our cases. So because people, and of course I worry about and have thought a lot about the protests that have been going on. There is no social distancing there. And there are some nights, hundreds of people. So we are encouraging people to stay masked and as much as they can to stay social distanced. I'm actually, on a personal note, getting ready to go to a restaurant for the first time tonight. We have not been out to a restaurant, my husband and I, and we're going tonight. And so I'm real interested in how this, you know, how it'll look, how it's going to go. I know a lot of people have been out, but I just urge people to continue to take precautions. This thing's still out there.
That's why I put those 5 guidelines up earlier, because
Yes.
we've got to keep our distance. We've got to be careful. We've got to use Zoom and other multimedia sources. And so good input. We've got to be careful.
Quite honestly, we're not all that in a hurry to open the front door of government.
Yeah.
So we'll get there, but you know, it's kind of dicey. Until there's a vaccine, this thing is probably going to be out there. So, Lyle, unfortunately, I am going to have to go to my next commitment.
We understand that, and thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. It looks like we've got quite a response. I've asked for what the actual numbers are here, and I haven't gotten that back, but hopefully we'll get it during the call, and I'll let you know.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate all of you. Stay safe, stay strong.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care. You bet.
Uh-huh.
All right. Thank you for your questions and for your participation in that little survey. Listen, we've got a great speaker next. Tim Feld is here. Tim's the vice president. He's the general counsel for Kentucky Employers Mutual Insurance, better known as KEMI. You know, KEMI is sort of supposed to be the last resort for workers' comp, but they have done such a great job over the past 10 years. I mean, they're the primary group that people go to. And anyway, we have a lot of clients that use them, and we use them and found them to be very responsive and helpful. Tim is a graduate of the University of Kentucky Law School. He's been practicing since 2001. He's had a great success in private practice before he joined KEMI. He actually teaches classes at the UK Law School in litigation and legal writing skills. He's been with KEMI since 2016. Tim, we're really glad you're here. Take it away and go ahead and share some things with us.
Thanks, Lyle. Just for the record, on the front screen, my email address had an I in it that probably didn't. So I would offer my services that if you guys have questions and don't want to ask them here, send me an email and I'll hopefully be able to give you the right answer or point you in the right direction. You know, Jim provides some great resources, and if I can echo some things special to work comp, I would be more than willing to do it. So
just text your email on the screen.
Oh, he's good. I told you he's good. If we could go to the next slide, Jim, I appreciate it. So a lot of people ask us, hey, is COVID going to be covered if my employees are diagnosed? And the answer is yes, they can file a claim. Maybe it will be covered. And the issue is, and what judges will look at, and what the system looks at is, they'll really look at the nature of your job, your employment. Does your job, does your type of business greater increase the risk of your employee contracting disease? And before COVID, before this year, the things we dealt with were, you know, hepatitis or HIV or something along that lines. So if that's the case, then your employee may be able to file a claim. I will tell you, with COVID, it's been kind of a unique experience for KEMI. We insured the very first COVID claim at Harrison Memorial. We early on picked up the claims of first responders and medical personnel because we thought it was legally and ethically the right thing to do. We felt like the Commonwealth was in a crisis. We felt like, as the leader in the work comp industry in Kentucky, we thought we should step up in this time of need. And so we early on picked up these claims. One of the areas that we picked up in was the school boards. So we insure about 85% of the school boards. Lyle talked about the need for food. 60% of kids in Kentucky get the majority of their calories from school lunch, breakfast and lunch. And what schools did under Governor Beshear is they wanted to continue to provide that food to those children during the pandemic. And the school bus drivers and bus monitors would pack the food up and then would deliver it every day or on multiple occasions throughout the week. We had a couple school boards where there was an outbreak within that group, and there would be 16 to 18 to 24 people who had coronavirus. In those situations, we could have said, hey, you got to prove it. We thought that those school bus drivers were doing the work just like the firefighters, just like the doctors, and we picked up those claims because we think they contracted it at work, and we thought it was the right thing to do. So that was our experience. And Jim, if we go to the next slide, I'd appreciate it. Some of you guys may know or may not know, Governor Beshear issued an executive order. I'm sure Jim touched on it at some point during these webinars, that there were two parts to this executive order. The first part is that covered all employees in Kentucky. If an employee went to a doctor and the doctor said, hey, you had exposure or you were diagnosed with COVID because of work, you immediately got TTD benefits. Now, for some of you HR people, you may know or probably know that means it's a partial wage replacement. Governor Beshear didn't want people who were exposed at work continuing to go to work to get paid, to pay their bills. So he in essence ordered the workers' compensation carriers to step up and pay these people's wage benefits during that quarantine period. the reality is, after this order was issued, the entire work comp industry went into a panic mode. The second part of the executive order dealt with a presumption. It said, if you are a first responder, you know, EMT, firefighter, or if you're a doctor or nurse or medical personnel, workers' compensation carriers, it is presumed that this is work related. I think what Governor Beshear didn't want was the doctor trying to cure people and take care of COVID patients on one hand, and on the other hand, fight the workers' compensation carrier to say this is work related. So the carriers were told, hey, if they fall into these categories, these jobs, this is going to be work related. Before the executive order came out, KEME had already decided to take this path because, again, we thought legally and morally it was the right thing to do. And so if you go to the next slide, Jim, I'm going to talk a little about nationally how Governor Beshear's executive order was received and how the rest of the nation was looking at COVID. In New York, they projected a $36 billion loss. California was projecting $11 billion in losses. Kentucky was looking at $450 to $900 million in losses. And every expert across the United States was saying this is going to absolutely bankrupt the work comp world. So as you can imagine, as Kentucky's largest work comp provider, we were very, very scared and very, very nervous. We, at that point, projected out $4 million in losses. Now, here's one of the scary parts is when every expert in the nation is saying X, and you think it's going to be Y, you really don't yell that it's going to be Y because you don't want to appear to be stupid. So you are quiet about it. And we had been paying these claims for a month. We had picked up the claims for TTD for Harrison Memorial. We've been picking up first responders claims. So we kind of had an idea on how many people were going to get it. And we had an idea on how much these claims were going to cost. And if you go to the next slide, Jim, we can talk about KEME's specific experience versus the national projections. So we've had 486 claims over the 3 months. Almost all of them are closed. Most of them were exposure only, or they were diagnosed with little to no treatment. We currently have 36 open claims. Again, we insure about 28% of the market. We have almost all the schools. This is really our been area of loss that we talked about. It was bus drivers and bus monitors. What we found is, and one of the reasons why we thought the losses would be different. Our current losses are $2.2 million, not the $450 million that people projected. I think we're going to end up between about $4 and $6 million, which is not an insignificant amount of money, but it's a really long way, you know, thankfully, from the projected catastrophic losses. The school bus drivers, what we found out is that I think we've all learned is COVID really hits the elderly population the hardest. School bus drivers, school bus monitors tend to be people, some of this population tend to be a little bit older or with underlying health conditions. And that's why they probably had it the worst. A lot of the other people who got COVID or were exposed to COVID were younger. So they just didn't have the detrimental effects of COVID. And if we go next slide, Jim. You know, and I'm not going to rehash this because I know Jim, I know Lyle, I know other speakers have talked about how to return safely. I know our HR consultant, Katie, calls in every week and follows this to say, how do we get my workers back to work safely? And I'll tell you what, your work comp carrier wants you to do this as much as anything. We want you to open back up. We want you to open back up safely so your employees are healthy. So we're going to ask you, you follow the governor's guidance, you follow the mayor's guidance, you're taking temperatures, you're listening to Lyle and Jim talk about this, you're asking your employee the right questions, and your carriers are really going to want you to have documentation that you're doing this. It will help you in defending these claims if you do have COVID claims, because it's kind of like proving, where did I get the flu? Did I get it at work? Did I get it from my wife? Did I get it from the grocery store? It's the same thing with COVID. Unless they can prove, unless that your employee who is diagnosed, unless they can prove they got it from work, they're going to have a harder time establishing that they were exposed and contracted and were diagnosed with COVID because of their experience at work. So the more you can do on the front end to keep people safe and healthy before they come into work, the more you can do to quickly address it if you do have a positive diagnosis, the better it is for yourself. It's better for your carrier. It's better for your entire workforce population. So if we go to the next slide. Here's a slide that I think everyone's gonna be interested in, and you can write this down and you can go back to your CEOs and tell them, hey, I figured out a way I think I can save us some money. I know the financial impact of COVID has been very real. Our premiums are down about 25%. Our losses are up some because of COVID. So every industry in the Commonwealth is being impacted by COVID. So here's a way for your company to potentially save money. Work comp premiums it's a pretty simple formula. And this is really simple, but it's your payroll times your class code. And that's like your risk. In essence, the guy who's chopping down trees pays more money than the lawyer does because the risk is different. And that's going to equal your workers' compensation premium. So what you're going to want to do is for those companies that had to lay off their workers, you're going to have lower premium because you have lower payroll. And so that's going to lead to a reduction in your premium charges or even a rebate check from your carrier. If you have paid furlough, if you were a company who had the economic means, either through the graciousness of the owner of the company or through a PPP loan, and said, hey, we are going to keep paying our people, but they're not going to work. The NCCI, which is a national organization that talks about how to charge premium, they came up with a class code for people who are paid but furloughed, and it's $0. In essence, if you're not working, you can't get hurt at work. Therefore, insurance company, you have no risk. Therefore, you can't charge premium. So if you fall into those first two categories, you have laid off people, your premium should be reduced. If you have paid furlough, your premium should be reduced. The third area is a little bit of a gray area. And I'm going to say this may, if your people are teleworking, this may reduce your premium. In essence, there's a couple different scenarios. If you think about your salesman or saleswoman who goes out into the workforce, drives around, visits her customers, they're at a greater risk than if they're at home sending emails and answering the phone. So your work comp carrier may reduce the premium depending upon it. It's really a fact-specific thing. So what I would do, I would have you guys call your insurance agent. They want to be of service to you as their customer and as their client. Call your insurance agent, ask for an audit, talk about your reduction in payroll, talk about your charges, and there may be a couple of you guys that your company has really increased greatly because of COVID. In essence, the services you provide really expanded you, and you had to hire 20 people this last couple months. If that's the case, your premiums are going to go up, and you might as well address it earlier rather than later. So, Lyle, I don't know if I addressed anything. I don't want it to be repetitive from what Jim had talked about previously, but that's kind of in a nutshell, how the work comp industry has reacted to COVID and how it impacts people's work comp policy and premium. And if you have any questions, or if Keamy can help you, let me know.
I wanted to put something up there, Lyle. Whoops, I don't know why it didn't stay up there. There we go. So the letter that he was talking about, or the direction, I believe this is the one you're talking about, if I'm not mistaken, which was the guidance on Executive Order 2020-277, which is the expansion for the temporary. And it talks about the temporary total disabilities, but then it also says that it is not, this has no bearing on final determination from the hearing officer. So this is one you were talking about, correct?
Yeah, it was really two parts, Jim. The governor came out with his executive order, and the insurance industry, the work comp industry, the insurance companies got together, and they were really, really, really scared. So the commissioner of the Department of Workers' Claim, Commissioner Swisher, came out and gave the industry, gave plaintiffs' bar, gave employees, employers some guidance. Exactly.
And this is the guidance, right?
Exactly.
Okay. The other thing I wanted to, and I just want to find out if you can correct me if I'm wrong, but this discussing with your agent, the other thing I encourage people to do, this is all the way back in week 1, I begged everybody, if you're going to have people working from home, make sure you let your workers' comp carrier know, not just in case it may reduce premium, but if this doesn't fall within the contract that you have with your insurance, you might get in some trouble. And requiring people to drive vehicles now instead of meeting people in their offices, however you change your your operation could impact whether it's even a covered claim or not.
That's a really good point, Jim, because you've got a couple different things there. One is, and I failed to mention this, if you think you have a potential exposure, tell your insurance company. Even if you think, hey, he got exposed, he's not going to get treatment, he's not going to miss work, whatever it is, report it. Your insurance company wants to know about these things. Second is to Jim's point, Kentucky Employers Mutually Right for Kentucky companies. If you have a guy who's going to live in Indiana, that may impact, and he's going to telework in Indiana, he gets hurt at work while teleworking, that may impact your coverage. So I would encourage you to follow Jim's lead and follow Jim's advice week one. Nice job there early in the gate. To come out and touch base with your insurance agents. Talk about how your business has changed, and because your insurance needs will change following this. So thank you.
All right.
Yeah, it's funny to see it come full circle, because like I said, if any of you on here were on week one, you'll remember one of the things I talked about was workers' comp and how this is going to impact you at home. This is a completely different ball game. If they slip and fall, trip and fall at home, and you're controlling their home atmosphere, you got to make sure that you understand what that is with your carrier. Tim, that was great information.
All right. Any questions pop up that we need to run by Tim?
Just a lot of people saying they can't believe that Lyle said he was going to give $1,000 for every single person that voted on that. That was nice, Lyle.
That was extreme, wasn't it? I know nothing. Okay. Tim, thank you very much. We really appreciate it. Hang with us if you want, but if you need to sign off, we sure understand. And thank you. You prepared this on short notice, and you really covered some good information for us. So we really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Jim, you're going to pick up and
yeah.
Got some
I'm
more.
going to run with it for a little while here. So I said I'm going to run with it for a little while, I think. So I do think anybody who has Kimi as your provider, give them a call and have them work through with you, because the information he's providing to you is critical. They want to help save money, and there may be a possibility for saving money if people are not having to drive back and forth to client locations and other things. But then there's the reverse of that, like we talked about before, with regard to people working from home and needing to make sure you as the employer provide an OSHA safe work environment. So we've talked about a lot of that and how it impacted making sure you have a business plan when you start working from home. So you ought to be on the phone with them if you haven't yet. That means you didn't listen week one. So I'm really pleased to hear that they're not on the same level of losses as some of the other states and some of the other companies calculated. That means they did their job very well and got on top of it. So I told you there'd be a little humor in this. Just FYI, this is the humor one, so if you don't like it, then it's not as good as last week when FFCRA frequently asked questions asked whether you could go on vacation with your kids. If you missed that, the answer is a possible maybe yes, as long as you can find some kind of obscure camp that your child was so desperately needing to go to, and now that camp is not being offered. Have a great vacation. Just send it to your employer and ask them for 12 weeks off. That's about as much as as the guidance suggested. And yeah, that's a little sarcastic. Don't go do it, but it's pretty close. All right, so faking COVID-19 is now being prosecuted as a crime. If you will remember, again, going back to week one, the whole reason why I got on the top part of this bandwagon of pushing this is I had a fake COVID-19 with a huge manufacturing facility in a particular state in southern United States, which was on the precipice, yes, on the edge of shutting down completely due to a COVID-19 on Friday, March the 13th. When I was dealing with that, I built out a whole wireframe structure for companies in dealing with a COVID. And I ended it in showing you that at the time I was on the phone with the governor, on the phone with a couple of senators, hospitals, you name it, trying to track down the truth of this before we pulled the trigger, and then we found out in the middle of the night it was all a hoax. So I started looking into potential crimes. I will neither confirm nor deny that this is the situation that we were involved in, but the Department of Justice has now clamped down on COVID-19 fraud claims. Here are the facts of the case. An employee wanting to take time off notified his employer that he was sick and had COVID-19. The employer understandably requested a medical note detailing the employee's condition. In order to comply with the employer's demand, the vacation-seeking employee, you can tell which side of this I may have been on, sent a physician note advising of COVID-19. The employer, following CDC guidelines, shut down to have the facility sanitized and sent several contact-traced employees home for 14 days to quarantine with full pay. Surprise, surprise, the employee did not have COVID-19 and the physician note was falsified. The employer is clearly entitled to legal recourse, but the employee is in a little bit more trouble. Whoops. DOJ has now filed federal criminal charges against the employee related to the vacationing scheme. I don't know whether it was vacation or not. Some of these are my editorial comments. Doctor's note was sent, wait, before I get to the punchline. For those of you that are wondering, because there are certain state crimes and there are certain federal crimes, and those of us who went through law school, in order for it to be a federal crime, must involve some type of either federal statute, or you had to be stupid enough to do something across state lines that then engages in interstate commerce. Well, this guy decided to use his email. He sent an email of a fake doctor's note to his employer in order to get COVID-19 relief from work. The doctor's note sent to the employer via email was transmitted through servers in different states before getting to the employer's headquarters. That constitutes the federal crime of interstate wire fraud. Yep. So the advice, had he come to this webinar, the advice he would have received from his attorney, which I am not, would have been, hey, number one, note from last week, FFCRA update, just use your kids as an excuse and say that there was a camp that you wanted to take them to that's closed and now you're stuck taking care of your kids in Florida on vacation at Disney World. Or take the doctor's note, hand deliver it, and have that delivered to, don't use a carrier, don't use an email, and don't use the United States Postal Service. If he had hand-delivered the note to them, then it wouldn't have constituted the federal crime of wire fraud. He's now facing quite a bit of punishment in a particular location. So that's your, what we call in the legal community, your criminal law primer. Don't fake COVID-19, and if you do, don't use your email because it does constitute interstate wire fraud. And yes, we can track down which email systems it bounced off of. This one happened to bounce off of Iowa before it reached somewhere in Pennsylvania regarding a particular location in the state of Georgia. 3 states involved, that would be interstate, and yes, email does constitute wire. It's the same as a phone system. So, surprise, surprise. All right. And I had said that these things were going to happen. People were falsifying and things were going to come to play on that. So that's your update on the crime and punishment. OSHA updated its face mask guidance. Yeah, now we're back to the dry stuff. EEOC was first, and now I'm doing OSHA. OSHA is my favorite. Because they have no sense of humor at all. At least EEOC stays a couple of months behind, so by the time you see the EEOC, you kind of look at it and go, yeah. OSHA just has no sense of humor. And the reason for including this now is this little phrase in the middle, when the EEOC starts using a phrase that goes back to the way they acted before, it scares me. General duty clause is a concern for anyone regarding OSHA. A little primer, a little recollection. We've talked about OSHA in the past. You are required to protect your employees and provide a safe and a safe workplace environment for your employees. And it's usually used for like asbestos, lead, paint fumes, things like that, to make sure that you're not at dust and HVAC, make sure you've got well ventilated, et cetera, et cetera. OSHA has now been weighing in on this for several reasons, including the surgical masks. So, first, frequently asked questions related to the difference between cloth face coverings, surgical masks, and respirators. We had a whole discussion about N95 masks, whether you could or should be using those, the different types of those, front aspirating versus not. I'm not an expert, so please don't ask, but I pointed out the differences between them. They've come out and said cloth face coverings do not constitute PPE. Surgical masks are not considered PPE if they are being used solely to contain the respiratory droplets of the person wearing them. In other words, source control. So if you are providing anything to your employees with regard to with regard to protecting themselves or protecting the environment from them, it is not technically PPE. As such, you are not required. Now, you are required in the state of Kentucky. You are not required federally, because if the governor says all employees in certain industries shall wear face masks, you're required by the state, but you're not required by OSHA. So keep in mind, when I'm giving OSHA update, this is only OSHA, not Governor Beshear. You've got to keep track of the state website with regard to what the current status is on what you do or don't have to do. Under federal PPE, because cloth face coverings and surgical masks for the employees are typically not related to environmental hazards, lead, paint fumes, paint particles, so on and so forth, they are not PPE. However, they then threw this in, and this is the part that you need to start paying attention to. The use of such face coverings would constitute, while not being mandated, would constitute part of a, quote, control plan designed to address hazards from SARS-CoV-2, otherwise known as COVID-19, under the general duty clause. And that's, I emphasize that because the general duty clause is that you have a general duty, as we've talked about even with your employees working from home, to protect the health, safety, and welfare of your employees. When the federal government starts talking about COVID-19 in a general duty sense, that means that they are expecting you to take reasonable measures. Means that they are on the verge right now of coming out with enforcement actions against people who are not requiring masks if there's a spike in COVID-19 at those facilities. So it is, if you look at the next quote here, employers may choose to use cloth face coverings as a means of source control, where transmission risks cannot be controlled through engineering or administrative controls, including social distancing. That's a little bit of a concern because it's not just guidance, that's the next step to when we open our office and we start looking at people. We're going to come down on those that didn't do this because of the general duty clause and source control and reasonable measures. So if you thought you could get away from wearing a mask, right now OSHA is pretty much saying you need to think twice about it, especially if you're a little bit larger. They then also reiterated guidance from CDC that cloth face coverings are not a substitute for social distancing. And then finally, they emphasized that surgical masks and cloth face coverings are not an acceptable substitute where respirators are required due to exposures to contaminants such as asbestos or silica. Last part is what we talked about in week 3, I believe. And no, I don't go back and try to remember what week. So if I'm wrong, just flip through the slides and you'll find it. I gave an OSHA update where the recommendation at the time was figure out ways, because of the shortage of N95 masks, they recommended that if there were tasks that could be postponed, don't do them. Well, they've come out with even more guidance right now, which is if you don't have respirators available, you cannot force people to do the work without the mandatory masks that have to be worn, or some other facsimile of those masks that have been approved by OSHA. If you can't protect your employees, don't try to have them do the job that they won't be protected during that activity. And that's the new guidance. All right. Last but not least, I think, last but not least, so if you have questions, throw them out. The next thing is the Treasury and SBA. I told you that the PPPFA would have new frequently asked questions and new guidance. None of this is really surprising except for one, so I put it on here so that you knew. Covered period is in fact extended through the end of the year. Maturity period, if you're lucky enough not to have already asked for one, you're going to get it now, and it will be for 5 years instead of 2, but if you got it before June 5th, you're not going to get the 5-year extension, you only get 2. Deferral period is extended 10 months after the end of the loan forgiveness period. We talked about that last week. It's not changed. This next one is the reason why this is on here. And then the last one is for my special friend who is a COVID-19 faker. We'll talk about that here in a second. But loan forgiveness modified from 75 to 60%. I'm not going to get into the algebra part of this. We talked about it in, I think, week 4 or 3, where I went through the algebra and all the calculations, 75%, and how to do that. It was 75% of the total, not as a qualifier. Well, they have come out last week. I made the comment that it may be 75% of the total spend versus 60% of the total loan, because they hadn't come out with any guidance in the way the PPP Flexibility Act was written. The 60% was in limbo. It sounded almost like it was going to be the total amount of the loan. And there's a lot of question about, wait a minute, should we take 75% of the spend toward payroll or 60% of the total toward payroll? Well, they've corrected that. And now it is 60% of the spend. And what that means is if you got a $100,000 loan and you only spent $55,000 on payroll, while I'm doing the math in my head here, then you can only get 55% or $55,000. So then the rest of it, you only get 55% of it forgiven, not 100%. So there's a way to run the calculation. I think I just said that backwards, but basically out of $100,000, you would get $96,500 roughly waived, and the other $3,500 would not be. And I know that's not exact, but that's kind of the way the calculation runs. It used to be based on a 75% pay toward payroll. Now it's 60%. So you do have some extra money to spend. Anything you don't spend, you pay back. That's the 10 months after the loan forgiveness and so on. All right. Last but not least, if you were the guy that lied and you get convicted and it's a felony for lying on a disease, using wire fraud to get there, you'll have a felony conviction. If it used to say before last Friday, if you received a felony in the last 5 years, you could not apply for a loan. Well, now they fixed that. For those of you felons out there, if the felony involved fraud, bribery, embezzlement, or a false statement in a loan application or in an application for federal assistance, then you can't get the money for 5 years. Any other felony, congratulations, that's only a 1-year prohibition, so feel free to start applying. That guy in Georgia still has some time to wait because he hasn't been convicted yet, but he'll have at least a 1 year. I'm trying to see here. it could potentially be fraud since it's wire fraud. So yeah, he's got 5 years. He's got to wait. So that's the update on the PPPFA. So any questions you have? Oh, I do need to keep in mind my caveat from every week. I'll say it again. I'm only as good as the information that's out there. The information that's out there is crap. So I'm doing the best I can with what the federal government tells me. If you ask me a question that is too technical and legal in nature and gets down into a specific situation with a specific employee or a specific loan, I can't give you advice over a webinar. That gets me in trouble. I'm giving general guidance to everyone here. So I'll try to do the best I can, but please understand if you get too far into the weeds, I'll have to say I can't. Or if I don't know the answer, I'll just make one up and you can't rely on me because I wasn't your attorney. So there you go.
Jim, somebody wants to know if they can apply for more PPP funds.
Yes and no. So you can apply for more PPP funds if you have a different company. I'm sorry, that was sarcastic. You can apply for funds up to the maximum of the calculation under PPP. Once you meet the maximum calculation under PPP, the answer is no. You can no longer apply for any additional funds beyond the maximum that you're allowed to get. If you have different FEIN numbers, each one of those FEIN, Federal Employer Identification Numbers, has the ability to apply for each one of those. Also, to the extent that you max out your PPP, you have the ability to get additional forgiveness through the employer deferment of the employer payroll taxes. You can also do the, there are several others out there. You may be able to apply for the EIDL. The extent to which you receive a grant, as I covered in week 2, I believe, will be rolled into your PPP. But if you use the monies outside of this time period for your EIDL, you don't get in trouble for using those as an added amount. But in terms of PPP itself, you're limited. You also do have the ability to get some, and we talked about this, I think, in week 2, some relief under the FFCRA as the employer for credits against payroll taxes. Those are allowed to a certain extent while you're doing PPP, but the interplay between the Flexibility Act and the FFCRA, we're still kind of fleshing that out, but you do get to use, like I said, the deferment. So.
Okay. Allison, any other questions?
Yes, so we've got a question about whether employers need to obtain the proper full-time employee headcount by a specific date, or if they have to maintain the proper headcount throughout the appropriate period.
Both, and it depends. There you go. Next. No, all right. So there's two sides to that. So if you're trying to use them in a calculation to make sure that you spent 60% of your payroll, then you have to make sure you meet that 60% payroll threshold. So they could be required to be maintained in order to meet that. But the deadline to bring back the full-time equivalent employee is not throughout. It is a deadline, and that deadline was extended from June 30th to December 31st. I do want to throw one thing in because that kind of triggered to me a frequently asked question that it's a brand new issue. It's not really a frequently asked, but it is something that's out there that I think you ought to know. People need to make a choice. A lot of you don't really have a choice if you've already spent it all. But you need to make a choice between a 24 week versus the 8-week PPP forgiveness because of the payment period. So if you elect the 24 weeks to pay, then you're expected to have 60% of your employees working during that 24 weeks. If you elect the 8-week, then that's when that shuts off and you can lay people back off, you can make business decisions and so on. But your calculation runs with whichever decision you make, whether you're going to go with the short 8-week, you get that choice. You can go with 8 weeks and run your calculation based on that 8 weeks. Or if you pick the 24 weeks, then you're going to have to show full-time equivalency and the calculation and all the different things over the entire, you'll have to show the 60% being spent for that entire 24 weeks or the full-time equivalency at December 31st. So there's still some decisions to be made. You still need to talk to your legal advisor or your accounting advisor or both, CFO and general counsel, so that they can walk you through the pitfalls of both. Frequently asked questions just came out on Friday from Treasury, and it's odd. I'm going to show you real quick. They actually came up with two, literally back to back. So they come up with, where are they? Right here. So they come up with the interim final rule. This is one I talked about that was crazy, that really frustrated me, and then they came out with the Flexibility Act immediately after that, or on that date. Then they came out with the interim final rule on revisions to the first interim final rule, which I don't know what final rule is. And then they have the interim final rule on additional revisions to the first interim final rule of the first interim final revisions of the first interim final rule from the day before. So this is how messed up these things are. Typically, we get these things 6 months ahead of when everything becomes law. But you see how quickly it's changing. You have interim final rule changes, and then additional changes the next day that change the day before's change of the week before's that changed the week before that. And this is why it's so confusing, is if you look in the last month, since May the 5th, we have an interim final rule, another one, another one, another one, another one, and that's through 18th of May. And then we have another final rule 2 days later, same exact day, June 5th, just because they didn't want to be upstaged by President Trump signing it into law on the 5th, so they decided they'd go ahead and throw one out there on telephone cooperatives. And then final rule on the 11th and another one on the 12th. So it is really bouncing every single day. There are things that you need to be careful of, and make sure you're asking the right questions of your CFO. Next.
So it looks like the next question we see is if an employee, so for the FFCRA leave, if an employee has used some of it for childcare and now the center is open, are the weeks still remaining in the bank available if childcare closes again?
Yes, in a nutshell, the time, be careful with how I answer it. If a child care center or a school is not available, then the person is entitled to the calculation for taking care of a child whose school is not open. And I believe that, don't quote me because I'm bouncing around a lot of things, I think that's 2/3 of their salary for up to 12 weeks total. So that time period can come and go based upon the eligibility. In fact, we talked about this about a month ago. Let's assume that somebody has child care available on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, but not on Tuesday and Thursday. Then you have to give them intermittent leave under the FMLEA because they do not have child care availability for 2 days out of the week. This would fall under the same thing. So they had it. They used their FMLEA for, I'm making up the time, they get a total of 12 weeks. And this also assumes, and again, this is the danger of giving this kind of guidance, this assumes that they didn't ever use any FMLA before, so they had a full 12 weeks available when this all started. They've used 2 weeks in for, well, let's say 4 weeks for when school was closed. Now school's open. They have 8 weeks left. If school closes next week, they'll still have that 8 weeks left, assuming that that they have no child care availability. So as long as the school's closed and they can show you, and you do have the ability to ask for documentation that, you know, hey, our school just closed because of an uptick in illness, so we had to close again. You have that availability.
Cool. Is that it, Allison?
Well, we've got one more, but I know we're already running over time, so I didn't know if we wanted to take one more, cut it off.
How are we doing? We still got most of our crowd on here. Let's hear it.
Okay,
Yeah.
so the question was just if your PPP funds need to be depleted before using any of the tax cuts in payroll pertaining to EFMLA or the SIC Act.
Yeah, that gets really into the weeds pretty far. I will say that PPP doesn't have to be depleted before using for sick leave because, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, well, several times, PPP allows for payment of sick leave and EFMLEA, but this gets into tax cuts in payroll, and that's getting into a whole lot of other things that you probably need to talk to someone about. In a nutshell, PPP is used for any payroll, which can include sick leave, can include FMLA leave, whether related to COVID or not. It can include, and this is what a little hint for those that haven't been on, it can include your SEP plan, your employee plans, your health care benefits, your retirement benefits, and there is a loophole about the size of a Mack truck for anybody who has a SEP plan with their employees. You have the ability to just dump money into that and say that's what we used it for. They've not come out with additional guidance on that. We talked about that a few weeks ago. So PPP is not exclusive, and now the payroll, or I'm sorry, the employer portion of payroll taxes and so on, deferment, not waiving, you can do that all the way through receipt and payment of the PPP money. So they have excluded that under the PPP flexibility. But those get into some really technical questions. You've got to be careful, and so I'm not comfortable giving broad base about tax cuts and so on, because one, I hate doing my own taxes. I've told you that before. Two, when you start getting into the interplay between PPP, FFCRA, FMLEA, that you really get into an individual employee where you need to see that employee's direction, why things happened, what you're planning on doing, or this employer specific plan and how that operates within everything else. There's a lot of moving parts with all these different laws, and that's why it becomes difficult.
Good,
All
I
right.
think that's all we've got.
Okay. Hey, thank you very much. Really appreciate it, Jim. And the tally is in, and it looks like we've got 52 people responded to our donation. So the biggest area was the Nourish organization, but the Mayor's Fund got almost as many, and a lot for the Corona response thing, fewer for the arts. But you know what? All these are going to be really pleased with the number. And Jim Morris and Tim Phil, I appreciate your pitching in. I'll send over a note with the numbers on it, and you guys can split up your donation however you'd like. I thank everybody for joining us today. Please notice on that last slide, put the last slide up, Jim.
Sorry,
It's okay. Sometimes
I forgot what I was doing.
But the last slide has our codes on it for the certification credit for SHRM and for HRCI. And if you're missing any of those, they're all on our website. We've gotten this credit every week. So, geez, you can't go to conferences, but you add these up and it starts being a real good number for wrapping up your certification. So thank you all for joining us. I'm Lyle Hanna with the Hanna Resource Group. This is number 13, week 13 for us. And we'll continue to take your input during the week. And I suspect we'll be back next week. So put it on your calendar. And we look forward to talking. Don't hesitate to call us anytime. That's it. You all have a great day.
Have a great day, everybody.